The park bullies mocked the old veteran, but when his biker friends roared up, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke as Harold Jennings eased himself onto his favorite park bench. At 78 years old, the Vietnam veteran's joints protested the simple act of sitting, but he refused to let age keep him from his daily ritual. The old oak tree that shaded his bench had been his constant companion for over 2 decades, its gnarled branches mirroring the weathered lines etched into Harold's face. Closing his eyes, Harold took a deep breath, savoring the tranquility of Willow Creek Park. The gentle rustle of leaves and distant laughter of children playing provided a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. He came here every day, rain or shine, to feed the ducks, read his newspaper, and reminisce about days long past. Today, however, the peace was shattered by the arrival of 3 young men, their raucous laughter and crude jokes cutting through the air like a knife. Harold's eyes snapped open, his weathered hands gripping his walking cane a little tighter as he watched the trio swagger down the path towards him. They couldn't have been more than 20, Harold surmised. Their baggy clothes, backwards caps, and the unmistakable scent of marijuana that clung to them like a cloud spoke volumes about their character. At least in Harold's estimation. He'd seen their type before, loitering in the park, hassling joggers, and leaving a trail of litter in their wake. As they drew nearer, Harold's steely blue eyes met theirs, and he saw the spark of mischief ignite. The tallest of the 3, a lanky youth with a patchy beard, elbowed his friends and jerked his chin in Harold's direction. The old veteran's jaw clenched, preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. Well, the tall one drawled, coming to a stop in front of Harold's bench. Look what we got here, boys. It's Grandpa Geezer out for his daily bird-watching session. His companions snickered, emboldened by their leader's mockery. The shortest of the 3, a stocky kid with a shaved head, chimed in. Careful, Zach. He might hit you with his cane if you get too close. Harold's grip on said cane tightened, his knuckles turning white. He'd faced down enemy soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam, survived firefights that haunted his dreams to this day. These punks didn't scare him, but he was also wise enough to know that at his age, a physical confrontation would not end well for him. I'm not looking for any trouble, boys, Harold said, his voice gravelly but firm. Why don't you go on about your business and leave an old man to his peace? The 3rd youth, a wiry kid with a nose ring, let out a harsh laugh. Oh, we are about our business, old-timer. And right now, our business is making sure this park stays fun for the young folks. No room for crusty old relics like you bringing down the vibe. Harold's eyes narrowed. This park is for everyone, son. I've been coming here longer than you've been alive. I fought for this country so people like you could enjoy freedoms like this. Show some respect. It was the wrong thing to say. The mention of his military service seemed to spark something ugly in the tall one, Zach. Oh, here we go with the respect your elders crap, Zach sneered, taking a step closer. News flash, Gramps. Nobody gives a shit about your war stories. You're just a washed-up old man taking up space. Why don't you do us all a favor and go rot in a nursing home where you belong? The words stung more than Harold cared to admit. He'd heard similar sentiments before, whispered behind his back or muttered under breath, but to have it thrown in his face so blatantly, with such venom, cut deep. You watch your mouth, boy, Harold growled, struggling to his feet. His bad knee protested, nearly buckling beneath him, but he gritted his teeth and stood tall. I may be old, but I've forgotten more about respect and honor than you'll ever know. The 3 young men exchanged glances, a predatory gleam in their eyes. They had him outnumbered, outmatched physically, and they knew it. Harold's heart began to race, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead as he realized the danger he was in. Oh yeah? The short one said, cracking his knuckles. Why don't you teach us a lesson then, old man? Show us all about that honor and respect. Harold's mind raced. He was no match for these thugs in a physical confrontation, but he'd be damned if he was going to back down or show fear. As the 3 began to close in around him, blocking his escape routes, Harold's free hand slipped into his pocket, fingers closing around his cell phone. He had options. He could call the police, but who knew how long they'd take to arrive? No, Harold needed immediate help from people he could trust. people who understood the meaning of loyalty and brotherhood. His thumb moved over the familiar buttons, muscle memory taking over as he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. As Zach reached out to shove him, a cruel smirk twisting his features, Harold's voice rang out clear and strong. "That's far enough. You boys have no idea who you're messing with. I've got friends who make you look like the snot-nosed brats you are, and they're on their way right now." The young men hesitated, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Harold pressed his advantage, standing as tall and imposing as his aged frame would allow. "So you've got two choices," he continued, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had once led men into battle. "You can walk away now, and we'll forget this ever happened. Or you can stick around and meet my friends. But I warn you, they're not as patient as I am." For a moment, silence reigned in the park. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the distant honk of a disappointed duck deprived of its daily bread. Harold held his breath, praying that his bluff would work, that these misguided youth would see reason and back down. But as Zach's eyes narrowed and his fists clenched, Harold realized with a sinking heart that this confrontation was far from over. He only hoped that help would arrive before things took a turn for the worse. As Harold stood his ground against the three young troublemakers, his mind raced back through the years. The park around him faded away, replaced by vivid memories of another time, another place where he had faced down danger with the same steely resolve. Harold Jennings hadn't always been the grizzled old veteran sitting on a park bench. Once, he had been young, strong, and full of idealism. Born in 1946 to working-class parents in a small Midwestern town, Harold had grown up with stories of his father's service in World War II ringing in his ears. The concepts of duty, honor, and sacrifice had been instilled in him from an early age. When the Vietnam War escalated in the mid-1960s, Harold had just turned 19. Despite his mother's tears and his girlfriend's pleas, he enlisted in the army, driven by a sense of patriotic duty and a desire to prove himself. Little did he know how profoundly that decision would shape the rest of his life. Basic training had been a shock to the system, but Harold had thrived under the discipline and structure. He'd always been athletic, captain of his high school football team, and the physical demands of military life suited him. But it was the camaraderie, the sense of brotherhood that formed between him and his fellow soldiers that truly transformed him. In particular, Harold formed a close bond with his bunkmate, a wiry Puerto Rican kid from the Bronx named Carlos Rodriguez. Carlos was everything Harold wasn't: streetwise, cynical, with a sharp wit that often got him in trouble with the drill sergeants. But beneath the tough exterior was a loyal friend with a heart of gold. The two became inseparable, watching each other's backs through the grueling weeks of training. When they received their deployment orders to Vietnam, Harold and Carlos made a pact. "We go together, we come home together," Carlos had said, his usually joking demeanor replaced by solemn intensity. They had clasped hands, sealing a brotherhood that would be tested in the crucible of war. The humid jungles of Vietnam were a far cry from the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Park. Harold could still recall the oppressive heat, the constant buzz of insects, and the perpetual fear that churned in his gut. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig could signal an ambush. He had seen good men, friends, cut down in the prime of their lives. One mission in particular stood out in Harold's memory. Their unit had been tasked with clearing a suspected Viet Cong hideout in a small village. What was supposed to be a routine operation quickly descended into chaos when they were caught in a carefully laid trap. The air had erupted with gunfire and the sharp cracks of mortar shells. Harold had found himself pinned down behind a crumbling stone wall, the acrid smell of cordite filling his nostrils as he returned fire. It was in that moment, with death seeming all but certain, that Harold had discovered the true meaning of brotherhood. Carlos, who had been separated from the main group, had seen Harold's predicament. Without hesitation, he had charged across the open ground, dodging bullets and shrapnel to reach his friend. Together, they had fought their way out, covering each other's backs and dragging wounded comrades to safety. That day had forged a bond between them, stronger than blood. When they returned to base, battered and exhausted but alive, Carlos had thrown his arm around Harold's shoulders and said with a grin, "Told you, hermano, together." The war had dragged on, each day blurring into the next in a haze of patrols, firefights, and long nights spent staring into the darkness, wondering if they'd live to see the dawn. Harold had seen the toll it took on his fellow soldiers. Some, like Carlos, seemed to grow harder, more determined with each passing day. Others cracked under the strain, succumbing to drug use or worse. Harold had found his own way of coping. He started keeping a journal, pouring out his fears, hopes, and observations onto the pages of a battered notebook. It became his confidant, his way of processing the horrors he witnessed and the guilt that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. One entry, written after a particularly harrowing battle, stood out in his memory. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing anymore. We're supposed to be helping these people, but all I see is destruction. Carlos says we can't think about it, that we just have to focus on keeping each other alive. But how can I not think about the lives we're taking, the homes we're destroying? I joined up to make a difference, to serve my country. Now I'm not sure what I'm serving anymore. The only thing that makes sense is looking out for my brothers. Without them, I think I'd lose myself entirely." It was that sense of brotherhood that had ultimately seen Harold through the war. When their tour of duty finally ended, he and Carlos had returned home changed men. The America they came back to was not the same one they had left. Anti-war protests raged across the country, and returning veterans often faced scorn and derision rather than the hero's welcome they had expected. For Harold, the adjustment to civilian life had been difficult. The skills that had kept him alive in the jungle seemed useless in the mundane world of 9-to-5 jobs and suburban living. Nightmares plagued his sleep, and he found himself jumping at sudden noises, always on edge. It was Carlos who had thrown him a lifeline. "Hey, hermano," he had said one day, roaring up to Harold's house on a gleaming Harley-Davidson. "You ever think about getting on two wheels? Nothing clears the head like the open road." That invitation had introduced Harold to a new brotherhood, the world of motorcycle clubs. Many of the members were fellow veterans, men who understood the weight of the memories Harold carried. On long rides through the countryside, with the wind in his face and the rumble of engines surrounding him, Harold had found a measure of peace. As the years passed, Harold had built a life for himself. He had married his high school sweetheart, Sarah, who had waited faithfully for him during the war. They had 2 children, and Harold had found work as a mechanic, his steady hands and attention to detail serving him well in civilian life. But he never forgot the bonds forged in combat, maintaining close ties with Carlos and other veterans. Now, as he faced down the 3 young troublemakers in the park, Harold drew strength from those memories. He might be old, his hair gray and his joints aching, but the spirit that had carried him through the war still burned bright. And he knew that even now, decades later, if he called for help, his brothers would come. The sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance snapped Harold back to the present. The 3 young men were still there, their bravado slightly shaken by Harold's confident declaration. As the engine grew louder, Harold allowed himself a small, grim smile. He hadn't been bluffing. Help was indeed on the way. "Last chance, boys," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Walk away now or prepare to face the consequences of your actions." The 3 exchanged uncertain glances, the first hints of fear creeping into their eyes as the roar of multiple motorcycles filled the air. Harold stood tall, his cane planted firmly on the ground, a veteran of wars, both foreign and personal, ready to face whatever came next. The rumble of approaching motorcycles seemed to hang in the air, a low, menacing growl that sent a shiver down Harold's spine. Not of fear, but of anticipation. The 3 young troublemakers, however, were visibly shaken. Their bravado wavered, uncertainty creeping into their eyes as they glanced nervously at each other, and then back at the old veteran who stood before them, unbowed and defiant. Zach, the tall one who had taken the lead in harassing Harold, was the first to recover his composure. His face twisted into a sneer, a desperate attempt to mask his growing unease. "You think we're scared of a bunch of old geezers on motorcycles?" he spat, taking a threatening step towards Harold. "We ain't afraid of nobody, old man. You and your biker buddies can go to hell." Harold stood his ground, his weathered hands gripping his cane tightly. He'd faced down worse than this punk in the jungles of Vietnam, and he wasn't about to back down now. "Son," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel, "you're making a mistake. Walk away now and we can all forget this ever happened." But Zach was too far gone, too invested in his tough guy image to back down. With a snarl, he lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab the front of Harold's jacket. "I said, we ain't afraid." His words were cut off as Harold reacted with a speed that belied his years. The old veteran's cane came up in a swift arc, catching Zach's outstretched arm and deflecting it to the side. In the same fluid motion, Harold stepped in close, using his body to unbalance the younger man. Zach stumbled, caught off guard by the old man's unexpected agility. His two friends who had been hanging back now moved in, their faces twisted with anger and embarrassment at seeing their leader so easily rebuffed. Harold knew he was in trouble. He might have been able to handle one of these punks, but three of them? His body, for all its muscle memory and fighting spirit, was still that of a 78-year-old man. He needed help, and he needed it now. As the three young men closed in, Harold backed up, his free hand slipping into his pocket to grasp his cell phone. His thumb moved over the familiar buttons, muscle memory taking over as he hit the speed dial for a number he hadn't used in years. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Harold's heart pounded in his chest as he kept his eyes on the advancing troublemakers. Come on, he muttered under his breath. On the 4th ring, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah? Bulldog?" Harold said, relief flooding through him at the sound of his old friend's voice. "It's Hawk. I'm in trouble at Willow Creek Park. 3 young punks." He didn't get to finish his sentence. The phone was suddenly knocked from his hand, skittering across the pavement as Zach's friend, the stocky one with the shaved head, lunged forward with a wild swing. Harold managed to dodge the clumsy attack, but he lost his balance in the process. His bad knee, the one that had taken shrapnel during a firefight near Quezon, buckled beneath him. He went down hard, pain shooting through his hip as he hit the ground. "Not so tough now, are you, old-timer?" Zach sneered, standing over Harold with his fists clenched. "Where are your biker friends now, huh?" Harold glared up at them, defiance burning in his eyes despite the pain. He might be down, but he wasn't out. Not by a long shot. "They're coming," he growled. "And when they get here, you boys are going to wish you'd never set foot in this park." The 3 young men laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness to it now. The sound of motorcycle engines was growing louder, closer. It was no longer just a distant threat, but an imminent reality. "We ain't afraid of no bikers," the one with the nose ring said, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see a gang of leather-clad riders bearing down on them at any moment. Zach, however, seemed determined to finish what he'd started. "Shut up," he snapped at his friend. "We're gonna teach this old fossil a lesson he won't forget. Show him and his biker buddies that they can't push us around." He reached down, grabbing Harold by the front of his jacket and hauling him halfway to his feet. Harold winced as pain shot through his hip, but he met Zach's glare with one of his own. He'd faced down enemy soldiers with nothing but a rifle and his wits. He'd survived firefights and ambushes, seen friends die, and kept on fighting. This punk didn't scare him. "You're making a big mistake, son," Harold said, his voice low and dangerous. "My friends aren't just any bikers. We're veterans. We've been through hell together, and we look after our own. You hurt me, and they'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." For a moment, uncertainty flickered in Zach's eyes. The roar of motorcycles was very close now, the thunderous sound of multiple engines echoing off the trees. But then his face hardened, anger and false bravado overriding his common sense. "I don't give a damn who your friends are," he snarled. "Nobody threatens me. Nobody." His fist drew back, and Harold braced himself for the blow. But before Zach could swing, a new voice cut through the air, deep and commanding. "I'd rethink that if I were you, boy." Everyone froze. Harold felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, relief and triumph washing over him. He knew that voice. He'd know it anywhere. Slowly Zach turned, his hand still fisted in Harold's jacket. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. There, astride a massive Harley-Davidson, sat a man who seemed more bare than human. His arms, thick as tree trunks and covered in tattoos, bulged beneath a leather vest emblazoned with military patches. A graying beard covered most of his face, but his eyes were sharp and hard as flint as he glared at the three young troublemakers. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, filling the park path, were at least a dozen more bikers, each one looking as tough and unforgiving as their leader. "Bulldog," Harold said, his voice filled with relief and affection. "Took you long enough, you old devil." The big man's stern expression softened slightly as he looked at Harold. "Hang in there, Hawk. We'll have you sorted out in no time." Then his gaze hardened again as he turned back to Zach and his friends. "Now, which one of you punks wants to explain why you're messing with our brother?" The three young men stood frozen, the realization of just how badly they had miscalculated finally sinking in. The confrontation had escalated far beyond what they had intended, and now they found themselves facing not just one old veteran, but a whole gang of them. As Bulldog and the other bikers dismounted their motorcycles, the air thick with tension, Harold knew that the real confrontation was just beginning. How it would end, he couldn't say. But one thing was certain. He was no longer alone. His brothers had come, just as he knew they would, ready to stand with him against whatever came next. The autumn air, once filled with the peaceful sounds of the park, now thrummed with tension. The rumble of motorcycle engines had faded to a low idle, but the atmosphere was no less charged. Bulldog, the massive leader of the biker group, stood like an immovable mountain, his eyes locked on Zach, who still had his fist clenched in Harold's jacket. "I'm only going to say this once," Bulldog growled, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a man used to being obeyed. "Let him go." For a moment, Zach seemed to wrestle with his pride, his survival instinct warring with his desire to maintain his tough image. But self-preservation won out. Slowly, reluctantly, he unclenched his fist, releasing Harold's jacket. As soon as Harold was free, two of the bikers moved forward. One, a lean, wiry man with salt and pepper hair, helped Harold to his feet. The other, a stocky woman with close-cropped gray hair and arms corded with muscle, positioned herself between Harold and the three young men, her stance protective and her expression daring them to try anything. "You okay, Hawk?" the lean man asked, concern evident in his voice. Harold nodded, wincing slightly as he put weight on his bad leg. "I'm all right, Whiskey. Nothing broken, just bruised, pride included." Whiskey's face darkened as he turned to glare at the three troublemakers. "Want us to teach these punks a lesson, Bulldog?" he asked, cracking his knuckles meaningfully. The three young men paled, taking an involuntary step back. But Bulldog held up a hand, his expression thoughtful. "Not yet," he rumbled. "I want to hear their side of the story first." His gaze swept over Zach and his friends. "Well, who wants to explain why you were harassing our brother?" Zach, his bravado crumbling in the face of the intimidating bikers, stammered. We didn't know he was with you guys. We were just messing around, you know?" "No harm meant." "No harm?" the woman standing guard over Harold snapped. "You call assaulting an elderly veteran no harm?" "Easy, Valkyrie," Bulldog said, though his own expression was far from forgiving. "Let's hear them out." The shortest of the three young men, the one with the shaved head, spoke up, his voice quavering. "We didn't mean for it to go this far. We thought." "You thought what?" Bulldog pressed. "That it was okay to pick on someone you saw as weak? That's not how real men behave, son." The third youth, the one with the nose ring, finally found his voice. "We're sorry, okay? We'll leave. Just don't hurt us." Bulldog exchanged a long look with Harold, an entire conversation passing between them in that silent moment. Then he turned back to the young men, his expression stern but no longer threatening. "Hurting you wouldn't solve anything," he said. "But you boys need to learn a lesson here. The man you were harassing? His name is Harold Jennings. He fought for this country in Vietnam, saw things you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares. He's earned the right to sit in this park in peace." Harold stepped forward, leaning on his cane but standing tall. "I don't want your fear or your pity," he said, addressing the three young men directly. "What I want is your understanding. We've all made mistakes, done things we're not proud of. The measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in how they pick themselves up afterward." A hush fell over the group as Harold's words sank in. Even the other bikers seemed moved, nodding in agreement. Zach and his friends shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Harold's steady gaze. Bulldog cleared his throat. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You three are going to apologize to Harold, a real apology, mind you. Then you're going to spend the next month volunteering at the local VA hospital. Maybe spending some time with vets will teach you the meaning of respect." The three young men nodded quickly, relief evident on their faces at this unexpected reprieve. "And if we ever catch you hassling anyone in this park again, anyone, you hear me? You'll wish we hadn't been so understanding today." "Clear?" "Crystal clear," Zach mumbled, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. One by one, the young men approached Harold, offering awkward but seemingly genuine apologies. Harold accepted them with grace, even going so far as to shake their hands. As the three prepared to leave, thoroughly chastened, Harold called out, "Hey boys." They turned, apprehension on their faces. But Harold's expression was kind. "Remember, it's never too late to change your path. Make something good of yourselves." They nodded, a hint of respect finally showing in their eyes before hurrying away. As the young men disappeared down the path, the tension in the air dissipated. The bikers gathered around Harold, clapping him on the back and expressing their relief that he was okay. "You know, Hawk," Bulldog said, a hint of a smile beneath his bushy beard, "when you called, I half expected to find you standing over 3 unconscious punks. You've gone soft in your old age." Harold chuckled. "Nah, just wiser. Violence begets violence. Sometimes the toughest thing to do is to show mercy." Valkyrie snorted. "Says the man who once took out an entire enemy patrol with nothing but a combat knife and a bad attitude." The group laughed, the camaraderie of shared experiences evident in their easy banter. As they helped Harold to a nearby bench, the conversation turned to memories of past rides, old friends, and the bonds that had brought them all together on this autumn day. Whiskey produced a flask from his jacket pocket, passing it around. "To brotherhood," he said, raising it in a toast before taking a swig and handing it to Harold. "To brotherhood," the group echoed. As Harold took a small sip, feeling the familiar burn of whiskey and the warmth of friendship, he looked around at the faces of his comrades. They were older now, lines etched deep by time and experience, hair grayed or gone altogether. But in their eyes, he could still see the young men and women they had once been, the soldiers who had stood beside him in the heat of battle. The park was peaceful once more, the earlier confrontation already fading like a bad dream. But as the afternoon wore on and the biker group settled in, sharing stories and laughter, Harold knew that something fundamental had changed. This park, his sanctuary for so many years, was no longer just a place of solitary reflection. It had become a gathering place for warriors, a spot where the bonds of brotherhood, forged in the crucible of war and tempered by the passing years, could be renewed and celebrated. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Harold felt a profound sense of gratitude. For his friends, for the life he had lived, and for the knowledge that no matter how many years passed, he would never truly stand alone. The day's events had been a stark reminder of the challenges that came with aging, the vulnerability that time imposed upon even the strongest among them. But it had also been a powerful affirmation of the strength found in unity, in the unbreakable bonds between those who had faced death together and emerged on the other side. As Bulldog began to recount a particularly hilarious misadventure from their younger days, drawing raucous laughter from the group, Harold settled back on the bench, a contented smile on his face. The park had always been his refuge, but now, surrounded by his brothers and sisters in arms, it felt like something more. It felt like home. The weeks following the confrontation in Willow Creek Park brought about changes that Harold Jennings could never have anticipated. The incident, which had started as a distressing encounter with 3 misguided youths, had blossomed into something unexpectedly positive, rippling out to touch not only Harold's life but the lives of many others in the community. True to their word, Zach and his 2 friends showed up at the VA hospital the very next week to begin their mandated volunteer work. Harold, who had been visiting his old war buddy Carlos for his weekly chess match, had been surprised to see them there, looking uncomfortable and out of place in their baggy clothes amid the sterile hospital environment. "Well, I'll be damned," Carlos had said, his eyebrows raising as he recognized the young men from Harold's description. Looks like Bulldog's ultimatum actually worked. Harold had watched as a nurse assigned the three to various tasks, changing bed sheets, delivering meals, and assisting with physical therapy sessions. It was clear from their awkward movements and hesitant interactions that this was far outside their comfort zone. But as the weeks went by, Harold noticed a gradual change in their demeanor. Zach, in particular, seemed to form a connection with a young veteran who had lost both legs in Afghanistan. Harold overheard snippets of their conversations during his visits. Talk of struggles with anger, of feeling out of place in civilian society, of the need to prove oneself. It was clear that Zach was seeing parallels between his own misdirected aggression and the challenges faced by returning veterans. 1 month turned into 2, then 3. Long after their mandated service had ended, Zach and his friends continued to show up at the VA hospital. They had found something there, a sense of purpose perhaps, or a new perspective on what true strength and resilience looked like. The change in the young men was remarkable. Gone was the swaggering bravado, replaced by a quiet confidence and a genuine desire to help. Harold couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, remembering his words to them that day in the park. "It's never too late to change your path." But the ripples of that day's event spread even further. Word of the incident had made its way through the local veteran community, and suddenly, Harold's quiet afternoons in the park were anything but solitary. It started with Bulldog and a few of the other bikers dropping by more frequently, ostensibly to check up on Harold, but really just to enjoy his company and the peaceful surroundings. Then other veterans began to appear. Some Harold knew, others he didn't. They came alone or in small groups, some walking with canes or prosthetic limbs, others pushing wheelchairs or guiding service dogs. The park bench that had once been Harold's solitary perch became a gathering place, a spot where stories were shared, memories honored, and new friendships forged. The local authorities, far from objecting to this informal gathering of veterans, embraced it. The mayor herself, whose father had served in Korea, arranged for the installation of several more benches and a small memorial plaque dedicated to all who had served. As autumn gave way to winter, then spring, Harold watched with amazement as Willow Creek Park transformed. It was no longer just a place of quiet reflection, but a living, breathing community hub. Veterans of different eras mingled, sharing experiences and offering support to one another. Younger veterans, initially hesitant, found mentors and confidants in their older counterparts. The changes weren't limited to the veteran community either. Inspired by Zach's transformation, other young people in the town began to take an interest. A veterans and youth mentoring program sprang up, pairing troubled teens with veteran mentors. The program was an immediate success, providing direction and purpose to kids who had been drifting aimlessly. Harold found himself busier than he had been in years. Between his regular park meetups, his increased involvement at the VA hospital, and his role as an advisor to the mentoring program, his days were full and purposeful. Sarah, his wife of over 5 decades, often teased him about his suddenly active social life. "I thought you were supposed to slow down in retirement," she'd say with a fond smile. "Instead, you're busier than ever." Harold would just chuckle and kiss her cheek. "What can I say, sweetheart? Turns out I've still got some fight left in me." It was on a warm day in late spring, almost a year after the confrontation that had started it all, that Harold found himself back on his favorite bench, surrounded by a group of fellow veterans and their younger mentees. The park was alive with activity. A volunteer group was planting flowers near the new memorial, kids were playing frisbee on the lawn, and the sound of laughter and friendly conversation filled the air. As Harold looked around at the faces of his friends, both old and new, he felt a profound sense of contentment. There was Bulldog, his gruff exterior belying his gentle way with the troubled teen he was mentoring. Valkyrie was there too, regaling a group of wide-eyed youngsters with sanitized war stories. Even Carlos had wheeled himself over from the VA hospital, happily cheating his way through a chess game with one of the volunteers. And there, Approaching the group with a slightly nervous smile was Zach. He had cut his hair and traded his baggy clothes for a neat polo shirt and jeans. In his hands, he held a small gift-wrapped package. "Mr. Jennings," he said, addressing Harold with a respect that would have been unthinkable a year ago. I wanted to give you something, to say thank you, for everything." Harold accepted the package with a raised eyebrow, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a framed photograph, a group shot of Zach and his friends with the veterans they had been working with at the VA hospital. Everyone was smiling, arms around each other's shoulders like old friends. "We're enlisting," Zach said quietly. "All three of us. We ship out for basic training next month." He paused, looking Harold in the eye. "We wanted you to be the first to know. You and your friends. You showed us what it really means to serve something bigger than ourselves." Harold felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the photograph, then back at Zach. He saw in the young man's eyes the same mix of determination and nervousness that he had felt so many years ago when he had made the decision to enlist. "I'm proud of you, son," Harold said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Just remember what you've learned here. About brotherhood, about service, about picking yourself up when you fall. Carry that with you and you'll do just fine." Zach nodded, blinking rapidly to hide the moisture in his eyes. Then, to Harold's surprise, the young man snapped to attention and offered a crisp salute. Harold returned it solemnly, feeling the weight of history and the promise of the future in that simple gesture. As Zach moved off to share his news with the others, Harold looked down at the photograph in his hands. He thought about the strange and wonderful journey that had led to this moment. From a confrontation born of misunderstanding to a transformation that had touched so many lives. He thought about the young man he had once been, stepping off a transport plane into the sweltering heat of Vietnam, and marveled at the twists and turns his life had taken since then. He thought about the friends he had lost, the battles he had fought, and the peace he had finally found. But mostly, he thought about the future, about Zach and others like him carrying forward the ideals of service and brotherhood. About this park, once his solitary refuge, now a thriving community hub. About the bridges being built between generations, between veterans and civilians, between past and future. Harold Jennings, retired veteran, husband, father, and now mentor and community leader, leaned back on his bench and smiled. The warmth of the spring sun on his face felt like a benediction, a promise of good things yet to come. He had faced down enemies in the jungles of Vietnam, confronted his own demons in the long years that followed, and stood his ground against troublemakers in this very park. But Harold realized that his greatest victory had been in opening his heart, in reaching out to others and allowing them to reach back. As the afternoon wore on and the park continued to buzz with life around him, Harold felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had fought his battles, weathered his storms, and now, in the autumn of his life, he had found not just a quiet harbor, but a vibrant community, a renewed purpose, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that his legacy would live on in the lives he had touched. The old veteran closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of laughter and friendship that filled the air. And in that moment, Harold Jennings knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not just surviving, but truly living, surrounded by the ever-expanding circle of his chosen family. It was, he reflected with a contented sigh, a pretty good way to spend one's golden years. And as the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Harold Jennings, the old veteran who had taken a stand, felt nothing but gratitude for the unexpected gift he had been given, the chance to make a difference, one life at a time, in the very park he had once thought was just a place to remember the past. Now he realized it had become something far greater, a place to build the future.